Filipinos, Asian, Pacific Islander, or just the ultimate identity crisis? Depending on who you ask, Filipinos are either Asian, Pacific Islander, or even Hispanic. So today, let's break it down once and for all. A question debated among Filipino Americans is, what is the Philippines? Is it Asian, or is it Pacific Islander? It's understandable why they might have such a question. Too Hispanicized to be Asian, but too Asian to be Hispanic or Pacific Islander. It can be hard for Filipinos in the US to see representations of other Asian cultures and see it as familiar. To some, the Pacific Islander label may also be a way to distance themselves from negative stereotypes associated with being Asian. So, what are Filipinos? I previously made a video about whether Vietnam is East or Southeast Asian. Please check that out if you haven't already. This video will be a similar video exploring the question of whether the Philippines is Asian or Pacific Islander from a number of different perspectives. Again, before we dive into things, I'll mention that I am not Filipino, but rather a Korean raised in the US. First of all, I want to mention that this debate is primarily a Filipino-American phenomenon. From what I've heard, it's not really a thing even in the rest of the Filipino diaspora. If you ask someone in the Philippines, they'll tell you, of course we're Asian. What's Pacific Islander, by the way? But go somewhere like UC Irvine, and suddenly, Filipinos are debating whether they're Asian or Pacific Islander. So why is that? Well, there are a couple of reasons, but the primary reasons are the US Census and the dynamics of the Asian diaspora in the US. First, the US Census has a huge impact on how Americans perceive race. The US Census creates some categories and terms, and gives others officiality and legitimacy. They help set the framework for how to categorize race in America. Since Asians and Pacific Islanders are given separate terms and are now grouped separately on the census as well, they are seen by many as legitimately different peoples with a hard line separating them. You're either one or the other, although this is complicated by the fact that in many cases, Asians and Pacific Islanders are still grouped together. As an Asian American myself, it's easy to see why Filipino Americans may not see themselves as Asian. In the US, Chinese Americans have historically been the largest Asian American group, and this is obvious, considering their dominance in Asian American spaces. Japanese Americans were another historically significant Asian American group that arrived in America after the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented Chinese immigration to the US. I remember having to read stories about Chinese and Japanese Americans while attending elementary school in California. The global significance of China and Japan, World War II, Asian American demographics, as well as American involvement in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, eventually meant that when Americans imagined Asians, they would imagine someone who looked more East Asian. And this is how Asian is popularly used in English today. To many Americans, the only types of Asian were Chinese and Japanese.
So, are you Chinese or Japanese?
Another factor is the US education system. Having gone through it, I can tell you that American education doesn't teach you about Asia or the Pacific, like at all, unless you take AP World History in high school, which most people don't. Compare this to the Philippines, where history education would, obviously, emphasize themselves, and provide Filipinos with a stronger sense of who they are. So, Asian Americans don't learn about their heritage culture through the education system. Their ideas of identity are shaped by who is around them, and primarily by mainstream discussions of race by Americans in an American context. How many Americans have ever heard of the term Austronesian, a core category to which Filipinos belong? Growing up, none of my classmates ever knew what Korea was until Gangnam Style came out in 2012 and Kim Jong-un tested more nukes in 2013. I remember being super shocked in 5th grade, meeting a guy during lunch that knew about Korea for the first time. it turned out he was half Japanese. I met another guy in middle school who had heard of Korea because his grandfather fought in the Korean War. Kind of shocking to see how popular and well-known Korea is now, in 2025. Anyway, despite being East Asian myself, I still have trouble relating to Chinese and Japanese Americans in many ways due to cultural differences. A lot of Asian American content is made so that only those who grew up in a Chinese household can relate. So it makes sense that a Filipino American with heritage from a culturally even more different country can be watching Crazy Rich Asians and think, hey, I'm supposed to be Asian, but I don't really relate to a lot of this. Maybe I'm actually a Pacific Islander. After all, we live on islands in the Pacific. And indeed, it is undeniable that Filipinos do have many things in common with the peoples of the Pacific. So, are they right? Let's examine the facts. So what separates Asia from the Pacific Islands? I think for this purpose, it may be better to use the term Oceania, which is the more widely used term. Okay, so what separates Asia from Oceania, or Oceania from North America for that matter? In reality, there's no single exact definition that's used by everybody. In its broadest definition, it includes every island in the Pacific, including places like Japan, the Aleutians, and the Channel Islands off the coast of California. But that's not really useful for our analysis. And that's not how people usually use the term either. After all, nobody would consider the Japanese Pacific Islanders, or the Aleut or Chumash for that matter. We might as well say that the Irish are Atlantic Islanders, rather than European. In its most common definition, Oceania is generally defined as the grouping of Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, plus Australia and New Zealand, and either the whole island of Papua or just Papua New Guinea. This latter grouping is known as Australasia. Interestingly, for much of the 19th century, the entire Malay Archipelago, which comprises Indonesia, the Philippines, and the island of Borneo, was also considered to be part of Oceania in a grouping called Malaysia. Who knows, maybe if this definition had kept, then the Philippines would not be considered Asian. But let's shift our perspective a bit. Stop imagining Asia and the Pacific separately, and just imagine the world without any divisions. Like I said previously, part of the reason why many Filipino Americans see themselves as Pacific Islander rather than Asian is because they see themselves as different from the Chinese and Japanese. But Asia is a big place. I'm sure Indians, Kazakhs, and Palestinians don't really see themselves as very similar to them either, or to Filipinos, or each other for that matter. Luckily, we can divide the place into multiple different groupings, some of which Filipinos may feel more home at. For example, let's look at a grouping of areas that speak Austronesian languages. Excluding some languages, such as the Spanish-based Creole Chavacano, the overwhelming majority of Filipinos are native speakers of Austronesian languages. This is a language grouping that likely originated in Taiwan before spreading to places like the Philippines, Indonesia, Madagascar, and all across the Pacific. It's not just language that's similar, but genetics, culture, and food as well. The catamaran and the outrigger canoe were their most important innovations, and this is what allowed the Austronesians to colonize islands across vast distances. They would take with them a number of crops like bananas, breadfruit, rice, coconuts, ube, pandan, and sugarcane. They also took with them dogs, pigs, and chickens. They covered themselves in elaborate tattoos, dyed their teeth black, built their house on stilts, chewed betel nut, played instruments like the slit drum and the nose flute, and engaged in headhunting. It's partly this Austronesian connection that makes some Filipino Americans think that Filipinos are Pacific Islander rather than Asian. But no one asks if Malagasy people are Pacific Islander or Asian rather than African. Anyway, Filipinos can be grouped as Austronesians. What else? Let's look at some history. The Philippines was a Spanish colony from 1565 until 1898, 333 years, which, fun fact, is longer than the United States has even existed. They gave them Catholicism, Spanish surnames, and leche flan. But in return, Spain took, well, everything. This fundamentally altered all aspects of the Philippines. Like I said, Filipinos have Spanish surnames. Tagalog has thousands of loanwords from Spanish, such as the word hello, ¿cómo está?, very clearly from Spanish, ¿cómo estás? The overwhelming majority of Filipinos are Catholic. Art, architecture, music, food, and clothing also had significant influence from Spain. Traditional scripts, such as baybayin, were supplanted by the Latin alphabet used by the Spaniards. The Manila galleon trade between the Philippines and Mexico was the main source of revenue for the Spanish Empire, and resulted in Filipinos going to Latin America and Latin Americans going to the Philippines. All this resulted in many cultural similarities between Spain, Latin America, and the Philippines. The presence of Catholicism has also meant that the Philippines has much in common with other Catholic and Christian nations. But when the Spanish got to the area, it wasn't just the Philippines that they decided to take over. The Philippines, together with Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, Palau, and the Caroline Islands, were all part of the Spanish East Indies. And the areas mentioned apart from the Philippines are always considered to be Oceanian, and the people there, Pacific Islanders. These countries are also Austronesian countries that received heavy Spanish influence. Like the Philippines, people in Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands have Spanish surnames. They are also overwhelmingly Catholic. A significant proportion of the people living there are even Filipino. In places like Saipan, there are more Filipinos than indigenous Chamorro. But it doesn't just stop there. The capital of the Spanish East Indies was Manila, and the large Filipino populations in the rest of the area has meant that these areas also received significant Filipino influence, which can be seen in dishes such as kilaguen, derived from Filipino kilawin. Also, the entirety of the Spanish East Indies, including the Philippines, all ended up becoming American colonies. Yes, America. After Spain, the US came in and said, hey, mind if we colonize you too? So, after the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Philippines and Guam became American colonies. The rest of the Spanish East Indies would become American too, after the United States defeated Japan in World War II. Either way, this had a significant impact on the Philippines. English is an official language alongside Filipino and widely used in government, business, education, and media. Filipinos commonly consume American media, listen to American music, and basketball is extremely popular. It's common for Filipinos to mix English into Tagalog when speaking, in a form of speaking known as Taglish. So, the Philippines also shares cultural similarities with the United States and areas colonized by the United States. The Philippines is geographically part of Southeast Asia. Again, if you watched my previous video on Vietnam, you'll know what the main differences are between East and Southeast Asia. If you haven't watched, know that Southeast Asia has the commonality of Indian influence, from religion to scripts. While Hinduism and Buddhism influenced the Philippines, they are not present to the same extent as in other parts of Southeast Asia. However, they brought with them writing. The scripts of the Philippines, the most famous of them being baybayin, descend from South Indian Brahmi scripts, like other abugidas, used across Southeast Asia. Also, the Philippines is today a member of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and participates in the Southeast Asian Games. We can further divide Southeast Asia into mainland Southeast Asia and Maritime Southeast Asia. Maritime Southeast Asia is perhaps the strongest argument for Filipinos being Asian and not Pacific Islander. Maritime Southeast Asia, which is roughly synonymous with the Malay Archipelago, shares the speaking of Austronesian languages and the fact that Brahmic religions were supplanted by Abrahamic ones. The people here were historically considered similar, with the Austronesian inhabitants of the islands being termed Malays. First, all of these countries are dominated by speakers of Austronesian languages. I remember a Filipino American I knew getting the critical language scholarship to study Indonesian, and talking about being surprised at how similar the language was to Tagalog. In my personal experience, growing up around a number of Filipinos and interacting with Indonesians as an adult, Indonesian accents in English sound pretty similar to a Filipino accent. In Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, Hinduism and Buddhism were replaced by Islam. In the Philippines and East Timor, Spanish and Portuguese colonization respectively meant that these areas became Catholic. Parts of the Philippines, such as Mindanao and the Sulu Archipelago, converted to Islam. The mixing of Indian and Islamic influence typical of maritime Southeast Asia is very clearly seen in pre-colonial Manila, which was ruled by Muslim Rajas over a populace that practiced a Hindu Tagalog syncretic religion. Even the word Manila is partly derived from the Sanskrit word Nila, meaning indigo. It's likely that had European colonization not occurred, the conversion of maritime Southeast Asia to Islam would have continued unabated, and the rest of the Philippines would also have converted to Islam. It's also clear that many Filipinos saw that they had much in common with their maritime Southeast Asian neighbors. Filipino intellectuals such as Jose Rizal, Apolinario Mabini, and Wenceslao Pinzons had pan-Malay sentiments. 9th President Diosdado Macapagal was a member of the Pan-Malayan Union founded by Pinzons. In 1962, the Philippines actually debated whether to change the country's name to Malaysia. This ended up not happening, as the modern-day country of Malaysia ended up claiming the name first in 1963. Imagine if China and Chinese Americans were swapped with Indonesia and Indonesian Americans. Despite religious and cultural differences, I think Filipino Americans would be less likely to consider themselves not Asian. Again, since this is primarily a Filipino American issue, I wanted to bring up Asian American discourse surrounding the question. There's a common argument made by those involved in American social justice activism that Filipino Americans are Asian American and not Pacific Islander American because the Filipino American experience is defined more by immigration, unlike Pacific Islander Americans, whose experiences are more defined by decolonization and the struggle for sovereignty. I've also seen people from these circles argue that what ties Asian American identity together, despite vast cultural differences, are struggles related to immigration. Personally, I'm not really swayed by this argument. I don't think immigration versus decolonization should be what defines these groups. What about when much of Asia, including the Philippines, was still colonized? What about independent nations in the Pacific, or nations that gained independence in the future? If the Northern Mariana Islands became independent, would the Chamorros there be more Asian and less Pacific Islander than Chamorros in Guam? Also, if being Asian American is defined by immigration, then what about Latinos who face similar issues? Why are they grouped separately? And what about groups like Palestinians, who are Asian but also have to deal with issues of colonization and sovereignty? And can we really say that Filipinos are closer to people in Pakistan than, say, Guam? So, what do I think? Filipinos share a lot in common with a wide-ranging number of peoples across the world. The Philippines is similar to the island nations around it, with no need for a hard division between Asia and Oceania. If Filipinos are to be grouped with other peoples, then I think the Philippines is best categorized as being part of maritime Southeast Asia, together with countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. But there are multiple categories that the Philippines falls into. Countries that eat rice, countries that eat lechon and flan, Catholic countries, Austronesian countries, Southeast Asian countries, archipelagic countries, newly industrialized countries, countries that love karaoke. These are all traits that are true of the Philippines, without having to box the place into any single category to the exclusion of others. The Philippines is similar to Indonesia. It is also similar to Guam. So, what do you think? Filipinos, Asian, or Pacific Islander? Thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and press the bell button to receive notifications whenever I release a new video. And please leave a comment for the algorithm.